McNulty Foundation, when they work with finalists like Mohammed got the McNulty Prize this year, they managed to find a Somali filmmaker who could bring this film to you that shows you more deeply what the situation in Somalia is like. It's quite fragile and quite dangerous. This is a really beautiful film. Let's welcome the film right now.
I was 9 years old when we left Swanak. Out, hundreds of people were killed when we landed in the United States. I distinctly remember watching the news and watching our entire city burn down. Somalia really is at a critical juncture. We have undergone 30 years of war and conflict. We have this entire generation of young people, they've experienced famine and drought, displacement, violent acts on a regular basis. I think that a lot of young people in my society feel unheard, marginalized, misunderstood. How do we start to rebuild, and how do we help people feel less lost? Our country is a very young population. When I founded IFTIN, the idea was to create job opportunities through entrepreneurship for young people. And the hope was that by giving employment, you would break this cycle of poverty and violence that young people were embedded in. But then we started seeing some challenges. In Somali culture, especially young men, we don't talk about our emotions. People don't talk about mental health. The scale of the problem was really shocking to us. Over 70% had moderate to severe anxiety disorders, nightmares, paralysis, panic attacks, anger. You can't provide job creation support in a vacuum. We realized that mental health wasn't complementary, mental health was foundational. That's been the core part of our program, merging this idea of trauma-informed care and mental health with job opportunities.
Ugunting waxweyn oo maanta anigii anfacdo oo nafsad ahaan oo maanta aan qof wax qabsan karo oo wixii hore uu ilaaway dhammaan walwalkeeni waa sidee.
Once we started incorporating mental health in our program, something amazing started happening. The people that we're training are going out and in turn having conversations and training their family members, their peer groups, their community members. Before we integrated mental health, over 40% of young people were dropping out of our classrooms. Once we integrated mental health, 90% were finishing the entire program and graduating. My vision is a Somalia where every young person has the opportunity to build a future for themselves. A Somalia where trauma is not a barrier, where a lack of opportunities is not a barrier, where they're connected to their community. I envision a Somalia where peace is rooted in healing and understanding, and to take what has worked in Somalia to the 2 billion other people that are living in conflict zones around the world.
After that powerful film, I think we're going to move on to our panel. I'm going to introduce all of our panelists, and then we'll begin the discussion to really try and understand how, even though we just watched this film about Somalia, this kind of trauma is not just confined to individuals or even one country, but really spans the globe. So here are the panelists.
Too many papers. Okay. Our first panelist is Mohammed Dini, the founder of Iftin Global. Mohammed is a McNulty Prize winner, as we heard. He's an Aspen Institute Fellow and BMW Foundation Responsible Leader. And his TED Talk has crossed 1 million views, while his writing, interviews, and keynotes reach millions globally. Mohammed. Dr. Comfort Arrow is our second panelist. She was appointed Crisis Group's president and CEO in December 2021. Dr. Arrow has spent her entire career working in conflicted affected countries. In between her 2 tenures at Crisis Group, she served as Deputy Africa Program Director for the International Center for Transitional Justice. She has a PhD from the London School of Economics. And our final panelist is Dr. Saida Abdi. Dr. Abdi is a psychotherapist and a researcher with expertise in refugee and immigrant trauma and resilience. Her expertise and passion is developing trauma-informed, culturally, clinically integrated services that are led or co-led by community members. She trains and consults nationally and internationally with organizations that are developing mental health services for refugees and immigrants. I'm almost going to stand because it's a little tricky to sit on these. So, I want to begin the discussion actually with comfort. We heard that there are 2 million people living in trauma-affected zones and conflict zones, and we also heard that it can often be intergenerational. So can you give us a bit of the big picture here? What are we looking at, and how long has this been going on?
Well, conflict is part of society, so it's been going on for a long time. First, thanks to the African Institute, and it's a real honour to be to share a panel with you. All the work that you've done as well, so congratulations as well.
Is that on?
Yeah, I just make it up. Right. So to answer your question, I'll even break down the 2 billion number that you gave, because, when I think about it in terms of the conflicts that Crisis Group works on, as an organization, we cover 70 conflicts throughout the world. On a monthly basis, we keep an eye on 70 live conflicts. Our analysts are based in 55 countries throughout every region, you can name it. Our organization was born 30 years ago. We were founded on the time of the Bosnia war in Sarajevo, in the midst of Rwanda, at the end of apartheid, South Africa, at the end of Operation Bring Hope, Somalia under Bush 1. And at the time of the civil war in Sierra Leone. And this was a period of optimism, of hope, that the end of the Cold War, the West was one, a time of great confidence in liberal intervention, and that a group of leaders would be able to shape the way in which conflicts could be brought to an end. It was a time of, a lot of confidence in United Nations peacekeeping, that the machinery of multilateralism could be brought to bear upon the conflicts of the world. You wanted to know how this started. I'm going to start with the one that I think a lot of us in the room will be familiar with, as opposed to the Second World War as well. Fast forward in the era of confidence as well. There was a decade, again, of optimism that the African Union, that was born out of the Organization of African Unity, would end the era of indifference and non-intervention, and would then take a greater role in solving a number of the conflicts that we've seen on the African continent. The United Nations was rolling full steam, whether it was in Latin America, right through to Africa, to Europe, to Asia, with a sense of confidence that we can bring all of this, and that came crash landing at the height of the Arab Spring. as well. And the reason I mentioned the Arab Spring is that this is where, in fact, let me step back a bit. You had 9/11 here, and the war and terror, I think, also added to a sense in which things were going in the wrong direction. So that was one period, to 9/11. And then you had sort of a lot of intervention from Iraq to Afghanistan as well. But you then started to see this happening in Somalia, in the Horn of Africa, in the Sahel region, where a number of countries that were seen as pseudo-democracies, countries that were able to stabilize themselves, started fracturing at the seams. And it was a period where we were seeing heightened recruitment of children, of women used as sex slaves or used as army wives as well. And you saw a lot of great violation against women and children and boys as well. And then you saw a lot of sort of breakdown in the order, whether it's in West Africa, in the Horn of Africa, in the Great Lakes region. And then you saw also a mirror of that in other places in the Middle East as well. Fast forward, and you've got Syria on one side, you've got the jihadi conflicts the going right across West Africa, and the one story that was the one consistency through all of this was the way in which armies on either the rebel side or the military side were able to recruit either forcefully or in different means young children to fight in these conflicts as well. And also that civilians were the crossroads of a lot of the violence as well. A lot of these conflicts are about power. A lot of these conflicts are about resources, but the victims of the conflicts are young boys, young girls, and women, and the most vulnerable as well. What we're watching today also in the Middle East, with Gaza and in Afghanistan, in Syria, also is a story in which these are great power competitions within societies, proxy wars also, but at the crossroads of all of these conflicts are innocent civilians as well. So that is in a nutshell the story of conflict, the change in nature of violence, where the guardrails, the constraints that would usually deter actors from committing these crimes, the institutions that you'd often turn to do with accountability, to do with justice, to bring an end to this violence, themselves are facing a lot of stress, are not able to provide a response, whether it's the United Nations Security Council, whether it's International Criminal Court, whether it's multilateralism writ large, themselves are finding themselves unable to provide the same ability to stop these conflicts as well. So that's the context in which we are discussing solutions to helping these.
Thank you so much for that. And that was a really great encapsulation of everything that we're talking about here. And you can all hear, right?
Yeah, you guys can keep it for,
Yeah,
I'll leave, yeah, have this and hold it.
we might need that. Yeah, Mohammed, let's go to you. That video was really powerful. And I think, brought home one point that Comfort was just making and that Peggy alluded to, which is that youth are often the most affected. And you left Somalia when you were 9. So can you talk about how did you start to notice that the young people around you and the young people that you were trying to work with were the most affected? And when did you start to put a name to this trauma tax, as you call it? What did you observe?
Thank you so much. So it's an absolute honor to be on a panel with two doctors, Dr. Sidney and Dr. Comfort.
I'm gonna save your life, man.
So, I'm not a doctor, but I have a law degree, which is not a good thing. So I actually began working in law. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and went to law school and started working in law. And about 12 years ago, I made a visit to Mogadishu, to where I was born, and I was there for about 2 weeks, but for me, it was absolutely transformational. It was kind of going back to the hospital I was born in and visiting kids, adults now, but people who I knew from my childhood when I left when I was 9 years old. So when I went back to the U.S. to working at that law firm, that trip really stayed with me. And what I did was I started a part-time project where I started helping young people. And then 10 years ago, I made the leap and decided to move to Mogadishu to start this NGO. And when I first began the NGO, the idea was there's so many young people living in poverty. So why don't I kind of give back to these young people and give them the opportunities that I had. So I started doing job creation programs. We started doing vocational training programs. We started microfinance initiatives. And so we were lending money, we were providing these young people training, we were giving these young people opportunities. And all of these young people, when they were joining our program, they would talk so compellingly about how they want to start a business and how they want to raise themselves out of poverty and how they want to support their families. But we would find that a large number of them were dropping out. They weren't really active in the classroom. Some of the businesses were failing. And initially, our teachers were thinking maybe we need to do better screening. Maybe some of them were saying, oh, young people aren't really, they're not taking responsibility. And so we started having conversations with these young people, and they would talk to us about kind of seeing a terrorist attack. They would talk to us about some of the violent acts that they would see. And so this is when we started realizing that something bigger was going on. I remember one young man in one of our classrooms, one of the teachers was thinking about completely dropping him out of the class because he wasn't really participating or being active. And we sat down with him and he told us his story that his family a few years ago had fled famine and were living in the outskirts of Mogadishu. And about a year earlier, his uncle had been killed in a terrorist attack. And so we thought, like, how can we tell someone to focus on financial planning and business plans when they're trying to process really deep-seated trauma? And we looked around and tried to find mental health experts. In Mogadishu, there was one, and they really didn't have time. And so I went on LinkedIn and I sent a message to this lady named Dr. Sarita, and I just said, we really need some help. We don't know what's going on. And yeah, so she did an assessment, and we found like a quarter of the young people in our class were suffering from PTSD. And that's when we realized this link between economic opportunity and mental health. So I mean, just as an example, a friend of mine gives me this example all the time. Imagine that you had a huge fight with a loved one at breakfast, and then you have to immediately go to work. Can you concentrate on a presentation? And now imagine you saw a terrorist attack, or you're in a violent household, and you do that regularly. You can't really function in the workplace. And so that's what I term the trauma tax. It's this tax on the ability of people to work, to earn an income, and the ability of people to raise themselves out of poverty.
Thank you for that. And I had actually realized that you reached out to on LinkedIn. That's a great story. So Saida, as a psychologist, tell us what perspective you bring to this. You talk about the psychological trauma as the most lasting legacy, that we can see limbs that are lost or wounds or scars, but we don't see the psychological trauma. And something that you said when we last spoke really stuck with me, which is you said that psychological trauma blunts memory and imagination. Can you tell us more about that?
First of all, thank you, and it just hit me. I'm grateful to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and it's just hit me the doors in Somalia that Muhammad opened for me for reaching out, because it gave me opportunities now to talk to you, to see their lives, and to think about the support. How can I support the work he's doing? So congratulations, and I'm just so grateful you're here and all you do. And I don't want to own psychologist. I'm a clinical social worker who's also a researcher, so I just want to make that clear before all my friends who are psychologists come after me. So I actually wrote an article which I will provide a link to with the preeminent researchers on children impacted by war. You may know some of them, Dr. Teresa Betancourt, Dr. Mina Fassel, there are 8 of us from across the world on that, Dr. Heidi Els. And we actually lay out one of the things that hits you as you do this work is when there is conflict, we reconstruct the physical. We rebuild buildings. I was in Amman, Jordan, a few years ago with a colleague for children in Syria who lost limbs, because you can actually see that. It's a physical impact of the conflict. But I have seen children and places that have been harmed physically by what happens. What lasts longer, what it is deeper, what takes longest to heal is the psychological and emotional impact of war. If we actually help children who lost limbs, who have been physically harmed, to recover at the same time from both the physical and the emotional, then we help them move forward in their lives. What trauma does, think about, Muhammad gave an example about your family and how it impacts if you had a fight. But what trauma does, it takes away our sense of safety, it takes away our trust in our elders. At the young Somali youth I talked to in Muhammad's program, one of the major things we talk about is their loss of trust and confidence in the leadership, in the elders, in their community, because we are responsible for what's happening to young people. So it takes away also your sense that things can be better, that the future holds something. That is why it's so important to attend to it when we're talking about jobs. There is something called foreshortened, a sense of foreshortened future, which is a sense like that you cannot see a future, you cannot imagine a future beyond what's happening, beyond the things you feel that you've experienced. And the reason is because both memory and imagination are actually held in the same place in our brain, in our brain networks. And when you go back, the way we plan the future is actually by using our imagination. We go back and we say, okay, I'm capable of this, I can do this. But if you're going back to your memory, which has been skewed or harmed by trauma, and that trauma is not healed, you cannot move forward. So what happens? Youth engage in behaviors that seem to us as quote unquote bad. Dangerous behaviors, using drugs, fighting, picking up a gun, killing, harming themselves. But for someone who cannot imagine a different future, they may not seem as serious. Those things may not seem as bad to them as they will to someone who has a future. We also talk about Muhammad is giving people a job. We have to do this training. They have to imagine a future where this training will be useful. But if you cannot imagine that future, then you cannot do that work. So this is why it's so important, really, to help the children and young people learn not only to heal from trauma, but to be able to imagine a future that is beautiful and joyful and connected and successful. And that is what the healing of trauma is all about.
Thank you. And we are going to hear more about the training, but first I wanted to talk about something you just said, which is it's really hard to imagine the future. And I'm sort of feeling that way just looking around at everything going on at the UN General Assembly this week, all the conversations about the status of funding. And that's sort of the big elephant in the room, right? Everybody is dealing with these very constrained resources. Given that, Kafra, I'd like you to address this, and also, but the other two of you have comments, please feel free to jump in. How do you begin to balance the need for addressing trauma with all of the other priorities that are pressing down on countries with very limited resources?
Yeah, look, that's a good question. I think one of the things that is very striking to me is that if you don't if you don't pursue a sustainable outcome in a conflict, then you're going to see that conflict return again. And I said to you that you can track, the pattern of conflicts, and you can track different moments since the end of the Cold War. There was one period between 2010 and 2015 that we tracked. A number of the conflicts that were on the scene were conflicts that were sort of repeating themselves. And these were also in countries where, guess what? The UN machine was in those places. So whether it's a UN mission or UNDP or whatever UN agencies as well, that you're seeing the repeat of conflicts in places where there had supposedly been a peace agreement that was signed. And what is very clear to us is that if you don't tackle the roots of a conflict, if you don't deal with the grievance also, and if you don't deal with some of the harm caused, the grievance is accountability in all its forms, that you're likely to see a repeat of the conflicts as well. And if you throw money at the problem without actually addressing the problem, no amount of international assistance can cover up for the grievances, right? No amount of humanitarian assistance can actually deal with the root causes of the conflict. They're temporary. They're paper over. It's like Band-Aid. But it doesn't deal with why a country, a society, went to war, why society brutalized its people, and why you've got these competing forces as well. And it's also true that a number of societies that we often rely on to be the custodians of international aid. So there's a lot of focus here because USAID is the largest sort of international assistance with humanitarian development. Although when you look at it within the context of US budget, it's only a very small percentage, 1% or so. There's a lot of focus on USAID, but there are other parts of the world, in Europe, for example, where you've seen a 17% drop in development and assist groups as well. So that's another reality as well. But if that development aid, if that humanitarian assistance is not actually going to the roots of the conflict, and by the way, is doing harm, is doing more harm, it's not conflict sensitive, it's not acutely aware of how it's dealing with the different intercommunal tensions that exist, and is adding more problems, then you're going to see a return to the conflicts as well. So there's a whole debate about the aid industry, there's a whole debate about what international humanitarian aid and development is doing, but if it doesn't tackle those conflicts, then you begin to ask yourself, what is the purpose of that aid? It's a temporary pause, but it doesn't go to the heart of the matter as well. But you're right to say that we are at an inflection moment. We're at a moment where the money that would often be used for international aid is now going to defence, because we have a war in Europe as well. You do also have a tussle between the domestic demands of a number of societies, countries that you'd normally rely on, and then taking the calculations that, well, over there is foreign, over there it's got nothing to do with us, that's not our war, that's not our conflict, that's not our problem. We've got real life problems domestically, and a number of societies, a number of governments are making that calculation that it's very easy, it's a low-hanging fruit to go after the international development aid, because that also has electoral consequences for a number of societies. So there's a number of things happening, and again, it's the victims of those conflicts and the courts at the centre of that as well.
Thank you. So, Mohammed, I want you to explore a little bit more of this idea that trauma is actually very much intermingled with economic development, even though people talk about it very differently. I mentioned earlier that I don't think very much, or did not before this panel, think much about trauma and mental health, even though I write about global health. And that's, I think, even more true if somebody's writing about economics. So talk to us about how these are not separate issues and what your program has done to prove that.
So thank you for that question. So I'm sure many of you have read the UN Declaration on mental health that came out, which was momentous, and there was a great incredible amount of commitment to mental health and furthering mental health. And when I was reading through it, I noticed two things. I think one was that there was a brief mention about economic mental health having an impact on economic development, but there was no commitment. There was no substantial commitment. And in the entire document, there was no mention of trauma, even though there's almost 2 billion people that live in these communities, and a quarter of them are suffering from PTSD. So for us, when we reached out to Dr. Saida via LinkedIn, she responded, and we worked on developing a mental health curriculum to integrate it to our job creation program. So the first thing we did was, because Somalia is a low resource environment, we had to train non-experts and actually build a network of community counselors. So over the last 7 years, we've certified over 100 mental health paraprofessionals across the country. Some of them have been part of our group and network for the past 8 years. And going back to your question, I think trauma has, so for the young people that we work with, we've seen 3 areas where trauma impacts economic opportunity. So the first is someone who has a job, they're unable to kind of sustain that job for long periods of time. So they may miss several days of work a month because they're suffering from trauma and dealing with trauma. So the term that's often referred to is absenteeism. The second thing we notice among young people is what's called presenteeism. So essentially, they're at work, but they're not really paying attention, they're not functioning, they're having angry outbursts because they're essentially having this fight or flight response, specifically in their workers. So you can imagine when you're criticized by your boss and you have a specific reaction because you're feeling threatened. And the third way is disrupted economic pathway. So for those who don't have a job, it's very difficult for them to get up in the morning and work on a CV and actually go out into interviews. So the WHO did a study a few years ago saying that depression and anxiety cost the global economy $1 trillion a year. But that was the first study of its kind. And nothing really has been done to quantify the economic impact of trauma. So what we did was we integrated mental health into all of our economic development programs. So a few years ago, what we did was so if someone wants to join a training as a mechanic or one of our vocational training programs, they're required to take our mental health intervention. So we designed a 12-week course that's led by one of our counselors, and essentially they're teaching them about self-regulation, anxiety management, basically giving them the tools that they need to deal with their trauma. I think we can't prevent these young people from being traumatized. I meet so many amazing young people. They wake up in the morning and I have so many aspirations, and they're brave enough to face a world that continually traumatizes them. And so the goal is, let's give them the tools and the skill sets that they need to be able to process and deal with this trauma. And so once we actually integrated this mental health intervention into all of our economic development programs, we actually saw a direct result in economic outcomes. So the retention rate in classrooms increased. Young people who are starting businesses were maintaining those businesses longer, just because they now have the tools to kind of be able to deal with kind of the challenges in a workplace environment or operating a business.
I found some of these numbers really impressive. So there was an 83% reduction in depression, 98% reduction in rage, it's all kinds of things. But the thing that I found most interesting was the return on economic investment. Tell us about that part.
So we did a study on our programs that incorporated mental health and our programs that didn't incorporate mental health, and we found that for every dollar that we invested in mental health, we had a return of $4.70 amount. So I think one of the things that we're really trying to show is that there is an economic return when you do trauma healing. So it is not just about healing an individual, but it's also healing entire economies, healing entire communities.
That seems like a very powerful example to convince governments to get interested. And have you seen that actually work in practice?
Yes, so one of our initial funders was the Dutch government when we first started seeing these issues, and so the program was basically a job creation program, and that was what the funding was earmarked for. And we had conversations with them. We gave them these numbers and these statistics, and we convinced them that let's integrate mental health into this program. And so the funding wasn't actually mental health, it was a workforce development program where mental health was a skill set that was taught as part of getting and maintaining a job.
That's really interesting. And, you know, at a national level, at a government level, that might be useful, but it seems like there also needs to be a larger cultural shift in society. Maybe you could talk about that. How does that entire population need to think differently about mental health? In the video, we saw that in Somalia, people don't really think about mental health. And we know that's true in lots of parts of the world. It's considered stigmatizing, and people don't even consider it real in some countries, including the one I grew up in. So how do you begin to change that cultural perspective?
Thank you for that question. I think actually relates back to the question about how do I want to link it back to the question about finances, because I think at different levels we need a shift in framework, how we think about the problem. So there is a conflict. I know you just came back from being
basis.
Is this still working? Yes. There is anywhere in the world where a war breaks out, there's a violent conflict where people are killed, children are harmed, and we go in and we bring political solutions. We think about the politics of it, how we, sort of stop the war and bring people together. But what has been harmed is relationships, connections, trust in each other. If we don't repair those things, the war will be back. Because the first instant of misunderstanding or grievance, as you said, we go back to the war. And so we really have to rethink how we address conflict and bring trauma at the center. Not only the conflict happened, what caused it in the sense of political sense, but also what trauma has resulted from this, and how do we make sure we are healing that trauma so that the conflict does not repeat. So that's one thing. That's the global and government and policy. The other reframing is when trauma happens, we have to really invest in changing of how we think. In Somalia, actually, both in Somalia and the Somalis in the diaspora, for example, there is a huge movement among young people where they're opening those doors. They're thinking about stigma and how it harms. They are expressing their own experiences of trauma and mental illness. One of the Eastern Globalist work, Mohammed's work, has been amazing. The work we've done in Somalia is actually having young people go back to their own communities. You want community members, people that are trusted. We work with schools. Mohammed didn't say anything about how many hundreds of teachers. So one of the things we did is actually go
To school.
Why am I having a problem? Sorry. To schools and work with teachers so that there are actually videos of our clinical staff, the staff that are delivering these services, going to schools, because teachers will use physical punishment to discipline children. And so teaching them, but I have worked here with Somali kids who are 20 years away from that experience, who are still experiencing PTSD because of what they experience in schools. And so how do we work with parents, teachers, religious leaders? We work with, so really going to the ground, to the communities. Stigma is about shame. And if you remove, so I will give you the analogy of what I use. I say to people when I talk in Somalia or other communities, because I work communities across the globe, I tell them, if someone was hit by a car and they broke their leg, what do you tell them? what do you do? Well, I go, I help this person, I lift them up. I try to take them to the doctor. Even if you're in the, in nomad in Somalia, you take them to someone who sets the broken leg, and then they lie down and we nurture them to heal. So if someone has a psychotic episode, it's exactly the same thing. One happened to your leg, one happened to your brain, but they are both, and because of religion, I would say, they're both illness that God has determined that, because I use that language, it's important in our culture because religion is the lens through which you see everything. This is the same way you will not blame someone for breaking their leg. You should blame them for having mental illness.
Can I just put a spotlight on something that you said that was important as well? You were talking about the fact that normally when you intervene to try and end a conflict, you focus on the politics of the conflict. I don't think you have a choice. You have to deal with because in the end, who's fighting? And you also have to have a security first approach. Something interesting now is happening in the context of the reform of the UN, and there's one bit I think that is worth keeping an eye on, which is what is happening to the peace building architecture. One of the lessons that the UN and others have learned is that there are multiple strategies, there are multiple interventions from outside that are brought into bear to help think through how to end conflicts. And oftentimes, those multiple template-like interventions, you take one example from one part of the world and assume that you can layer it into another country, assuming that there's a one-size-fits-all for ending a conflict and for dealing with why societies went to war and how then to end the violence as well. Well, now we have one of I think an important part of the UN 80 reform beyond the financial crisis. I think one of the most important aspects of Secretary General Guterres' own sort of agenda for peace going forward is to get the peace-building architecture to start thinking about what national authorities and what societies need in terms of helping to implement the peace agreement. And what he is advocating for, whether it works or not, because you're still dealing with power dynamics in these societies, he says you've got to work with those societies, think through what the national strategies are. Now, where this process begins to tumble down and fail is there is somebody in every society, there's somebody in every national authority who decides who sits at the table. If you've got the wrong set of characters, wrong set of actors at the table, you're not going to be able to do this issue. Psychosocial trauma stuff is right at the bottom of the pile. Because everybody's thinking about the security, you've got to end the guns, put the guns to the table. You've got to think about demilitarization. You've got to think about, standing up a new government. You've got to think about power sharing. You've got to think about how you include all these various fighters, who are fighting. And every single time, for everything that you're thinking about, these things go right down to the bottom. So the Dutch government is rare in this case that they think about those kind of things. If every government like the Dutch, then that would be good, because there are a number of governments who they prioritise and they don't think about these things because they see them as low-hanging fruits, and they are not quick fixes, because every government that pours money into a government has to be able to account to their parliament. And every parliament, every government wants a quick fix story to say this is the impact, whereas a psychosocial trauma work, it takes a long time to see the end result as well. So it's patient capital that we're talking about. The success of the work that you're doing, it requires governments, it requires donors, it requires people who believe in the long patient capital. Because you're not going to be able to fix a society that's been at war for so long, and Somalia is a classic case where you need long patient capital to get a success that you're driving for as well. So I just wanted to layer that, connect what you're saying to what is going on in the current ecosystem.
So something you just said reminded me of.
Your voice creates.
So I think you made a good point when you say peace processes involve individuals, and those individuals are traumatized. It can undermine peace processes. And so we are starting, in Somalia, we're starting to work with government to integrate mental health into leadership development. So
You beat
One
me
of-
to it. I was actually just about to ask you about government, but can you also talk about other organizations within the country? Where are you getting support from?
So we, from in terms of government, I wanted to share the story really quickly. In our leaders, so we hold these sessions with youth and at events. One of the things that we do is we have everyone come in a circle, and then we give everyone a balloon, and we tell them, you want everyone to kind of tell us something that you're really anxious about today, and just blow into the balloon. And everybody kind of goes around in the circle, and the balloons go big, and then we say, now release your anxiety. And a few months ago, there was someone from, I'm not going to say which ministry, someone from one of the government ministries in Somalia. And he said, this is a
It's still here, buddy.
Yes. And so I'm not going to mention the specific ministry, but he said, this is amazing. This is wonderful. I feel so much better. Just listening to these stories, trauma impacts our work. There's this director general who's terrorizing his staff, and kind of I'm starting to make the link between trauma and how he's treating his staff. And so we're now doing like a leadership development program that integrates trauma healing for this ministry, which I will not mention. But yes, so we're starting to work with other organizations outside of ours. We developed a toolkit where we are able to kind of integrate mental health into any economic development program. And so many organizations have come to us and just said, can you, we see this in our community, can you help integrate this into our community? So we've been kind of working with other organizations and lending them this model in the hopes that we can have a ripple effect.
I mean, some of the metrics, like the 98% job retention rate, I can see that would really convince people. But just purely in terms of mental health benefits, have you also experienced resistance? Have organizations or people say, you're talking about nonsense, that's not real, that's not important, they just need to toughen up, etc.?
Yeah, so that, as is the case in many communities, mental health is extremely taboo in Somalia. And I know many of you have probably seen the case in your own communities. And obviously when someone mentions mental health, it immediately goes to the most severe case. And someone would equate it to being crazy or completely out of their mind. And so, we do cultural change programs where we teach people about mental health. But we found that when we're trying to work with young people in these job creation programs, it's very difficult to talk to them about mental health. And we said, okay, let's not spend so much time trying to convince them. So we don't call it mental health training, we call it life skills and job readiness training. So it's an easy entry point where they're like, okay, I love job skills, I would love to be skilled. But in reality, they're learning about anxiety management, self-regulation as part of that. So that's the way we've kind of used it as an entry point. But
It's clever marketing.
Can I just add something to that?
So actually, this is the same model we use in the U.S. Like I do school-based mental health.
And people, because I have to,
No, it's okay. So think about trauma. Trauma is about loss, as I said before. If you then bring people more loss, like something's wrong with you, so now I'm going to heal you, you're re-traumatizing them. But when you bring a job in a place that it's so hard to get a job, so the positive framing gives people an opportunity to heal while not feeling less than. And here I actually tell people, your child will do well in school if we do this. So
as long as they say yes, I'm fine with it. Good.
So you just avoid the words mental health and rebrand it in a different way.
exactly, you want a positive, because what mental health in the work we do, even if you took away that term, is about helping people heal and achieve life goals, right? The young people in Somalia would often say, one of the developmental tasks is getting married. But if you can't get a job, it's really hard to get married. So you have young people getting older and older, and it's really anxiety provoking because here they're missing, milestones in their lives. So, but if you said in a place where there's a lot of trauma, if you said to them, well, you only get this job if you went to trauma healing, then they may feel that's another way of stigmatizing them. But if you said that we are providing this service and actually these activities we're doing will help you do well in your job, do well in your life. When I run activities Europe all the time, and I do trainings for them online on Zoom. When we talk about they're so brave. They talk about their own experiences with trauma. They talk about their own symptoms, and they actually bring real life examples on why this is important.
So I like the idea of not thinking of trauma as an illness, but framing it differently. In the video, I mean, I understand why the person was blowing the balloons ensemble. And I also find it really amusing when people are connecting it to bad bosses as if that's the only trauma they know. But I was wondering, how do you see, and maybe this is a question for you, Saida, or maybe for either of you, but how do you see trauma manifest differently in young people versus middle-aged or older people? Even though we are seeing mostly young people in these conflict zones, there are other generations that are also affected, and how do the effects differ?
In Somalia, right now, when you meet youth, we know there are things that are happening that are actually dangerous, not only to the youth themselves, but to the society. I'm talking about youth that join groups that are harming the community itself. We also see youth that are trying to do whatever. I'm on TikTok, and I go in there in the Somali TikTok just so I can understand what youth are going through. I don't post.
You're a stalker.
And there was a young man, yes, it's a heartbreaking story actually. There was a young man in Tunis who posted, "This is the last time you will see me. I am going on a boat and I will either die or I will get to Europe." And it broke my heart. But that is what the way it manifests is there is actually a desire, so much desire to get out of where you are. And because I'm sorry, this is Anila now. What trauma does is what's called catastrophizing. So if you have a problem, the problem looks 20 times, 100 times bigger. So it's not just that you can't get a job, you can't get married, you have finished college. We're talking about youth who have finished college, but still can't get the life they need. But it's also you cannot see that future in that place. And so this young man, people were literally responding to him saying, please, please, please don't go, please don't go. But we have lost so many youths on boats. We have lost, but behaviors such as we see in Mogadishu, I can tell more about this, youth who are smoking, what's the thing they smoke? No, they are actually there, thank you. It's glue sniffing, no, they are actually in the streets just sniffing. It is to numb the pain. Look, I will leave you with this, even if this is my last comment, in the children who have experienced trauma are different than any other children because their children harmed by the society, harmed by adults, harmed by governments, harmed by their neighbors. They have been injured, even though we may not see the injury, but they're in so much pain, they would rather do things that will lead to their death, okay? To numb the pain, to numb that they are in constant, the fact that the world thinks leaving children who have experienced trauma to just live their lives and keep going, or young people to just, it's just to me as someone who breathes and lives this, it's mind-boggling. It's a setup for harm for themselves and harm for those around them as well.
So I wanted to add something very quickly to that about young people who are leaving Somalia. So oftentimes the discussion that we have is, why don't we create jobs for young people, and then that would prevent them from migrating and leaving the country. And the challenge that we faced is when we do create jobs for some of these young people, they save out the money that they earn from the job that we give them, and then they pay someone to take them abroad across the Mediterranean Ocean. And we realized, and so one of the things that we saw was that once we integrated mental health into our programming, those who received our mental health intervention were not migrating, or the reduction decreased, because they imagined the future within their country where they could build and where they would not be truly traumatized again. And so there's a definite link between the two as well.
That's a really powerful statement. I think I know we're going to open the field to questions from the audience.
I have down here.
Oh, I see a hand.
There's
already.
seats up front. You can come sit down.
There's a bunch of people went around the corner, so please come on in. There's a seat right here.
I think it's going to be tough to get the mics across, so just stand up and yell your question.
Stand up. Oh, that's stand out. Yes. And tell us who you are, please. My name is Dr. Stella Vecina. I'm from Kenya. I work at the intersection of health systems and gender justice, addressing health inequities and inequalities within the African continent. Thank you so much for such a powerful presentation. My question is kind of like a complex one, because we're living in polycrisis. You know, if it's not climate change, if it's not food security, it's conflict. So there is a continuous ongoing trauma and re-traumatizing around the people, the children, the young people, the women that you're working with. I'm wondering how then do you keep track about the successes in terms of metrics around how that awareness is integrating amidst all these polycrises that we're experiencing in the world?
Thank you for that question. I'm going to pass it to Dr. Sarita, who designed our metrics and assessments. So.
Brain is cop out. So take it away, but it's to you.
It's a hard story on behalf.
Because this is more. Those are hard questions.
It's a hard question.
It's a classic impact question.
But it goes back to what you said. There's a polycrisis. Not these things aren't separate. They're all interlinked as well. As I said at the beginning, it is not a surprise to me that a number of conflicts are repeating themselves. The cycle of conflict. And that
Because you're not dealing with the roots of the conflict.
you're looking for a quick fix. You're looking to be able to count the numbers and say, we have succeeded. Are you not prepared to do the long term? I said patient capital,
The long-term, medium-term work.
to deal with the heart of the matter as well. So you're not going to, if you're looking for success, it's very quietly done. And it takes time. And you're not going to get the results that you're looking for all the time. And you also have to prioritize. Now, this is a very interesting, in fact, you just provided a very interesting example that in the world where there is a migration crisis, it's not just the West that is suffering a migration crisis. We have just been told that when you invest in mental health training and you can provide jobs as well, you can also deal with the migration problem. We shouldn't miss this story. I don't know how many in your pool of students that you have a number associated with that, but that is an important story. If you're going to take anything out of this room, take that, because there's also a message to governments who want quick results. Governments rarely stay behind, and there's a lot of fatigue and there's competing priorities. So this is an important message that can you multiply? Is there a multiplying effect to this one example that we've provided? Because I kid you not, we are living in a period where wars are rising in every single region, where it's not just about power politics. There are generations of children who know no other life but war. Somalia started in 1991, and here we are. It's spanning several decades, spanning several generations. our societies are getting younger. They're not getting older, they're getting younger. The African continent itself will outstrip China by 2050, and there's a demographic changes as well. These are societies, not just on the continent, but in the Middle East, in Asia, in Myanmar, for example, when children are born in war, they're likely to die in war, they're likely to birth children in war, but no other life as well. You're not going to solve the migration crisis that every continent is facing if you don't deal with why societies are going to war in the first place.
Thank you for that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Can I add one little thing? Because now I thought about your question. So two things. One is that for me, I actually don't know what I said.
It doesn't like you, so I'm going to hold it.
And your voice radiates pretty well.
My voice carries. That's the Somali thing. So two things to answer your question. One is that stories, personal stories. I actually had this young person who now is providing trauma support tell me that her plan before she started this work was to get in a boat and leave. But now this has offered her, this work, doing trauma work, has offered her an opportunity, but also to give back to her community, to support and heal her community. That's one. The second thing is that I don't think we should ever think about the work we do in trauma especially, it's saving one child at a time. It's literally saving one child. For me, it is saving one child. And the aggregate will come, but it is really those individuals save a child, save a family, save a youth, because we need to prioritize that.
Yep. And just to add to that, like zooming in, I think for us, what has been really effective is data. Often people, when I talk to people about trauma and economic development, they agree with me, like that makes complete sense. But it's very difficult to quantify because it's not something short term. So what we've done is we show results and we really measure impact. So for example, the program that we did this job creation program almost 7 years ago, and we followed up 3 years later with the young people, and about 30% had migrated illegally. And then we integrated mental health, and so far, fingers crossed, I think like 5% have migrated, compared to the 30% that did not receive economic development. So it's about making sure that we show people the data of the impact that we're having and actually measuring the link between economic development and trauma.
So you do have metrics.
Yes, yeah, we do.
There was a question over there. Yes.
I think this young lady had it.
Oh, thank you so much to the panelists for an excellent thought and rearranging session. I'm Jefferson. I live and work in Nigeria, where we provide contraceptive access to the rural last mile to hundreds of thousands of women.
If you say Nigeria,
Yes, that's right. Yeah, northern Nigeria. I'm really curious about this idea of reconciliation. So I think about places like Rwanda after the war, right? And how societies need to rebuild themselves after horrendous traumatic conflict. I wonder in Somalia, but also, in Comfort, your case, around the world, how you see building that element of reconciliation into mental health, into healing. How does that look like? And maybe some stories and examples would be really illuminating. Thank you.
I wonder if, since we have so many questions, if you want to take a couple at a time.
Sure, yeah, there's one question over there, yep.
Janice, Brenda has the mic, so she has the power. She's second.
Sorry. Here. There you go.
Hi, yes. I wanted to ask, my name is Brian. I'm with Search for Common Ground. And the one experience I've had working on trauma has been a program in Northeast Nigeria where we worked with former child soldiers. So I'm wondering, do you have experience and what are your approaches to working with trauma from people who have committed violence, who have committed crime, who have been, the aggressors as well? Because that was something that we battled with in that experience, and I'd love to hear your perspective on it.
No, we stop answering now. Or?
You want to take one more question and then go for
This young lady has
Hi, thank you for an illuminating panel. Mohammed, I followed your work. I'm part of the Aspen group as well.
introduce yourself.
I'm Kasaga, Teach for All, and we care about all kids achieving their fullest potential in education. So the question I have is actually zooming into the child. As a person who lost my own family early on, the question I always had, and I've met with most kids, is the why. Why historically, why us, why we, there's that question. I think I still live with that question. Maybe I also need my own therapy. So the question is the why, how in your interventions you address the why. As a teenager, I thought about that I almost wanted either join a rebel group or end up taking the why of why it happens to us, why we see other kids striving. So if you could name how you address that or you don't. Yeah, thank you.
I think that's
Maria.
I'll answer the question about working with ex-combatants and people who've committed violence. So one of the first programs that we did was rehabilitating former child soldiers and ex-combatants. So Somalia right now is facing conflict within a militant group, and the majority of their soldiers are young people. Many of them who were radicalized, and some of them because they were looking for economic opportunities. And so a few years ago, the government did a forgiveness program where they allowed people to come back in, and we designed a mental health intervention where we provided counseling support as a tool to integrate them back into these communities. Dr. Srila could talk a bit more about it, but one of the young men that we worked with went through our program for a period of a year. So we gave him support to start a brickmaking business, and then we also provided counseling and mental health support. And over the course of 2 years, he actually helped about 60 others defect from Al-Shabaab. So basically and when I say defect, he would give them salt burner phones and tell them, I want you to come to this location, and once you come there, call me. And so it was so we had this incredible ripple effect because one of the things, and Dr. Sveta mentioned it earlier, is that these young people that we provide mental health support for, they go out and they're acting as leaders within their communities. And then we've also done forgiveness ceremonies where we actually work with the victims of these atrocities and figure out how they deal with their own trauma and how they live with the perpetrators within the same community.
And one thing I would add about that program is when that program started, the 18 team couldn't get, so part of it was that the youth, once they graduate, everything's done, they did the intervention, then they will get the job, they can do whatever they want. They choose what they want to go towards the future. And the business is the stigma around that issue was so great that they couldn't get partners to work with the youth. And so they actually had to do a lot of community stigma reduction in the community because people were also afraid, and the fact that there has been no violence committed by any of the youth the program worked with is a really wonderful thing. I want to also add that we actually created a manual, and I want to say that because it's a manual that is an intervention that I actually use here already, so it's a trauma intervention, sort of CBT based, but it has its culture. So it's a narrative because we are a culture that tells the stories. So it's the story of those two boys and what happened to them and how they came back to their community and that how people saw their pain instead of seeing the activities that are negative that they were engaging. So we do have a lot of experience. That was like 2 years. That work? Yeah.
No.
Do you want to address either of the other questions that people asked?
yes.
The other two questions.
I think the question about reconciliation and trauma. Do you want to take the? I think I wanted to answer the question about the why.
Yeah.
I think oftentimes we try to help our communities and we try to support them, and when that someone doesn't accept that support, we often don't ask why are they taking advantage of the support? Why are they taking advantage of this amazing opportunity that we're giving them? And I think it's important to ask that why. I think when we first started our program, it took us a long time to ask why is this happening, but when we finally did, it kind of really opened up a lot for us. So for me, from my personal experience, I remember a few years ago, I was in southern Somalia for a conference, and a friend of mine from Columbus, Ohio, who started an NGO very similar to mine, was in the city, and we organized time to meet for coffee. And on my way there, a terrorist group attacked the hotel that he was staying in, and over 20 people were killed that evening. And I remember the next day going to the mass burial of these 20 plus people. And I, of course, I was traumatized myself, and it took me a long time to kind of deal with it. But the one thing that came to mind was like, I can't imagine what it would be like seeing this on a regular basis, on a yearly basis. This was, I was just heading to the hotel. I didn't see the attack, but I can't imagine what it would be for young people. And when you ask why is someone joining a terrorist group, or why is someone joining criminal activity, and it's always coming back to trauma. And, I remember the story of this young woman who was traumatized because of an attack, a gender-based violence attack. She went to the police and she didn't really get any support. And she ended up joining the terrorist group because they said, oh, we're going to give you revenge against the perpetrator. And so talking about peace and reconciliation, I think it's very important because it's individuals and elders that are in charge of these peace and reconciliation processes. And if they're having angry outbursts and they're not trustful, you can't really move forward with it.
But just on that last point, the other observation I'm making is that in some of the conflicts that we've seen of recent times, whether it's the coups that we saw in the Sahel, whether it's the youthful revolution that we saw in Sudan, whether it's the recent public outrage in Nepal, these are all by young people who were sold a dream of going to school, get educated, we will deal with corruption, and we're going to bring democracy. You can't eat democracy, so, and the societies of these children, they said, well, no, we're not doing this anymore. We're now going to mount an assault on these governments. It's very easy to label these young people as terrorists as well, because also what is the one thing that is shrinking in these societies? The chance for young people to speak our truth against political leaders who have sold them a lie. That we're going to deal with corruption, that we're going to deal with governance, we're going to deal with et cetera, and they said enough is enough. And so they hit back, and I say this because in this age of disinformation and fake news, it's the one label that is very easy to attach to a lot of these young people is, oh, you're a terror, you're a terrorist, or you're part of a terror group as well. Whereas what a number of these young people are seeking is a political space, is the right to express their grievance against their governments. And when their governments don't listen, they mount this kind of response. And they do back military coups, not because they believe in the man in uniform, but because they are fed up with a regime that is not delivering change to them. They decide to oust their governments, not necessarily because they believe that the next leader is going to provide change, but they are frustrated with the current leadership as well. So it's worth bearing in mind all these issues, and it speaks to your question about reconciliation. If in the end the reconciliation doesn't change the way in which the society is ordered, then that reconciliation has its limits. But also, if reconciliation is used as a way in which to suppress violence, suppress silence, then you have to question the very fabric of that reconciliation process as well.
I think we really only have time for one question.
Oh, the mic doesn't like it.
Oh, never mind. So just one thing about reconciliation and the why question. And I know, don't ask the why unless you have a space where you can real unpack. I have to move forward.
Well, thank you so much. I'm sorry. My name is Vesna Golic. I am Executive Director of Common Threads Project. We are grantee of Laureate Tishuli Nations Fund. And we were here in the United States, also in Nepal and Nigeria, Ukraine, Ecuador, with women survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, war conflict, and post-conflict. And these issues are very close to my heart as well, because I was a refugee in that same Balkan, and ICG was born, peace activist throughout my life. I'm still engaged in the region that's healing, trying to heal from that conflict. And huge congratulations, really, because we don't hear talk about trauma healing, especially medium to long-term trauma healing, being integrated in humanitarian and post-humanitarian context. We hear about crisis interventions, and we hear that anything beyond 4, sometimes 12 sessions of interventions is already not stable. So my issue and question for the panel is about scalability, that magic word that we keep hearing from donors and actors. And so if it's not scalable, we cannot engage. We have to move on to the next crisis. How do we scale in case when, for example, now in Nepal, we are for the first time seeing women who were violated 30 years ago in the conflict, who are now in their 60s and 70s with prolapsed organs, living in shame, stigma, blame for decades. And for the first time, I'm being asked, because they're now for the first time activists in Nepal. And we see that in Nigeria, we see men violated, we see girls violated, and so on. How do we bring this up? How do we collaborate from grassroots level to ICG, to World Health Organization, really, to India, with limited metrics that we have to actually provide trauma survivors who are living in communities around us with what they need.
We're almost out of time, but Mohammed, maybe you can take that one and answer briefly.
So I think your question is very important because these communities that we all work in are very low resource. There is no funding for mental health support. And in Somalia, it's pretty much non-existent. Globally, I think it's like 2 to 5% globally. So for us, scaling was really important. So our intervention right now is a 12-week mental health intervention where we provide training for lay counselors, and then they implement intervention. So it looks like someone gets into an economic development program. They do 2 hours of group counseling a week for 12 weeks. And initially, it might sound it may not sound like a lot, but we've had incredible results in reducing depression, anxiety, and increasing economic outcomes. And what we're now doing is we're giving this toolkit to other organizations, whether it's NGOs or TVET centers or business schools, where they're able to actually implement this low-cost intervention within their communities. And in Somalia, it cost us about $4 for one trauma healing session when we've scaled. And that model relies on lay counselors and non-experts and kind of giving them a basic framework to be able to implement this on a grassroots level. And I think Somalia has been a case study for us, and we're hoping to scale globally. And there are a lot of organizations doing amazing work. Just your talk about survivors of gender-based violence reminds me of the study that was done in Southeast Asia. They provided trauma healing for women receiving microfinance loans. And they found that those who received the loans and who received mental health support were returning the loans at a much larger percentage than those who didn't receive mental health support. And so there's a direct link between mental health and economic development, and I think it's important to highlight that.
That's a great note to end this panel on. Please thank all of our panelists for their great insights.
Thank you so much, Apoorva. I'm Aprilaj. I'm the executive director at the McNulty Foundation. I see so many leaders in this room that focus on mental health, healing, trauma. So we have a reception. I hope you'll continue the conversation. Dr. Comfort, Dr. Saeed, Mohammed, thank you for taking us into these really deep and complex issues. I feel like all of us right now are in this exercise of prioritization and looking for sustainable solutions. And so you've helped us to imagine a future with this solution. So thank you. All right. Thank you for joining us.